So yesterday I did a video lecture, part two, on sexuality, and I've received a number of questions asking me to extend the analysis there to some extent. And more generally, I've been asked to have something to say about psychoanalytic perspectives on power and politics. Got a bit into that the other day in relation to Donald Trump. In regard to sexuality, I did want to mention that one of the many sources of impotence, psychosexual impotence in men is the inhibition. I don't want to say inhibition of aggression, I want to say inhibition of what feels to that man as aggression. In other words, it may not so much be his aggression that he fears, it may be that he attaches aggressive meanings to activities that are not particularly intrinsically aggressive at all, but that he sees them as such and may see them as possibly destructively aggressive. In other words, he becomes impotent because the idea of penetrating a woman in his mind is associated with some kind of fantasy of an aggressive invasion. I well recall many years ago a patient who had his penis all confused with a cruise missile. And it was not for nothing that he had that confusion. He actually was filled with a great deal of anger and rage towards his mother. And of course that gets extended to all females. I mean, a part of him really wanted to destroy his mother, and so he feared that his penis would destroy the woman, tantamount to launching a missile. That's an extreme case, but a lot of men are unconsciously worried about hurting the woman through the act of intercourse. Sometimes hard for them to grasp the reality that the woman may actually like this and derive pleasure from intercourse, but he has the idea that she's this fragile thing that must be protected, and so he can't launch, as it were. Okay. Well, this is just a sexual expression of a problem that many men suffer from. That is a fear of their own aggression. And I must say, for some years I've wondered about the question, what are the psychological origins of the fact that sometimes quite early in our lives, some of us develop a certain tendency to identify with the underdog, while others clearly identify with the overdog. As a boy, I tended, as a good Canadian boy, of course, I was a hockey fan, and I tended to root for the team that was not expected to win. Well, of course, being in Toronto, I was a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and they were usually the team that was not expected to win for good reasons, but I went on rooting for them anyway. but more generally, I mean, I'm a leftist. I've always rooted for the working class against their exploiters. I've always rooted for the what we used to call during the Occupy days the 1%, but now it's 0.01%, the mega rich, the oligarchs. But I always rooted for the 99%. So I have tended to identify in significant ways with the underdog, and to identify with struggles of the workers, struggles of the left to fight back. I've identified with revolutionary figures. On the wall behind me, you may see a picture of former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau embracing Fidel Castro, and in another picture we have Che Guevara leaning forward to light Jean-Paul Sartre's cigar while Simone de Beauvoir looks on. So I've always tended to identify with the underdog, and it's always really bothered me that certain leaders are able to mobilize their aggression into the struggle up to a certain point, but then some of them have a marked tendency to choke. Like at the last minute, they withdraw from the struggle, they cave in, they surrender, they clutch defeat from the jaws of victory. I think there's quite a history of this on the left. Why? Of course, the most recent example of this I have is Bernie Sanders. I'm trying to overcome my anger at him. I was an enthusiastic supporter. And, okay, he wasn't winning. And then coronavirus hit, and he threw in the towel. Why didn't he carry on anyway to the very end of the primaries? He didn't want people forced to go out and vote during the coronavirus. That's good. Push for a mail ballot. Carry on anyway. Get to the convention with as many delegates as you can. And then bargain like hell. You know, tell Biden that if he wants your support, if he wants you to urge youth and your many followers to support him, then sign this document promising to enact certain executive orders the day you enter the White House. You make demands. You push. You have to be willing to, as it were, hold a gun to your opponent's head. But Bernie kept throwing in the towel all along. In the debates, he would refer to his good friend Joe Biden. He would say, whoever wins will support the other. I mean, you lose the struggle right there. Immediately they know that if they push you out, they're going to have your support anyway. And like a good boy, Bernie delivers his support. Now, I'm trying to back off from this anger because I listen very carefully to what Noam Chomsky has to say. And Chomsky says that, you know, Trump is the leader of a death cult, and another 4 years of Trump would just be so disastrous. We have to vote for anyone who has any chance whatsoever of blocking Trump. So Chomsky pushes the lesser of two evils philosophy. I get his argument. I get it. Um, I have trouble seeing that Biden is the lesser of two evils, but I suppose he clearly is. Um, anyway, Bernie throws in the towel way too soon. There tends to be a history of people doing this on the left. Um, so what is this about? Um, Clearly, Bernie is a guy who identifies with the underdog, wants to support the underdog. He wants to practice the politics of love, but the underdog is weak, and the underdog, being weak, has trouble fighting. And the practitioners of the politics of love have a hard time fighting. They have a hard time deploying aggression. They don't want to be mean. Bernie has such a need to be a Mr. Nice Guy. That doesn't work when the stakes are so high. You can't afford to be Mr. Nice Guy. You have to be willing to go in for the kill, metaphorically speaking. Are you serious about the fight, or are you not serious? People on the left take up moral positions. They're moral. They're moralizing. They're trying to engage in a politics of conscience. But what really cripples them, I think, is the superego. They're often ashamed of their aggression, embarrassed and ashamed at their aggression. I think they tend to suppress it. Then it gets projected outwards, and it gets taken over by the superego. Their aggression, their inhibited aggression, gets taken over by the superego and turned against them. And so now here we are, engaged in the politics of love with all of the right values, conscientious, moral, but we're loaded with a superego, which makes it difficult for us to deploy our aggression outwards against the enemy, and instead turns it on ourselves. And so we become inhibited. We don't strike at the moment when it is necessary to strike. We don't know how to fight when it's necessary to fight. Those who identify with the overdog often have little trouble being vicious. I'm thinking of McConnell, Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell. Contrast that personality. It's an ugly personality. Contrast that to Bernie. I would take Bernie any day, but McConnell has no inhibition in fighting hard and fighting dirty for what he wants, and he therefore wins a lot of the time. Democrats in the U.S. just seem to cave. Now, of course, part of the reason they're caving is that they're being paid off by the same donors who are paying the Republicans. I'm not naive. I'm not overlooking the role of sheer corruption in all of this. But I don't think Bernie's corrupt. But I think he probably suffers from an inhibition. It took me many years in my own analysis to overcome my own inhibitions. Certainly as a graduate student, I had a writer's block. I had great trouble writing and finishing my PhD, and with the help of analysis, it became pretty clear that I was under the irrational fantasy that becoming Dr. Carveth was somehow killing my father. He was a family physician. He was Dr. Carveth. How dare I become Dr. Carveth? The day I got my PhD, he and my mother took me out to a wonderful restaurant to celebrate and gave me a wonderful gift and wrote a wonderful card, and I'm sitting there thinking I've just planted a knife in my father's back. Now, of course, that was crazy. He was proud as punch. But in my mind, this was some kind of Oedipal victory. I was bumping the old man off the log. That's a neurotic fantasy of Oedipal triumph. And it had delayed my obtaining of the degree. It had very much delayed the writing of the dissertation. Finally, I overcame the inhibitions and I did it. Now, of course, the inhibition wasn't forever conquered. It went on and expressed itself in a lot of other ways, but as time has gone on, I've pretty well defeated that inhibition. But I know many men who, to my dismay, throw in the towel at the last minute, clutch defeat from the jaws of victory. They give up right at the moment when, with another push, they could have won. So people who identify with the overdog seem to be able to be killers. People who identify with the underdog seem to cave. Now, this is not always the case. I think it's in a recent interview with Chomsky that he mentions that to really succeed in these struggles, we often have to have a leader who is capable of what he called, I think, the sublime madness. Sublime madness. This is a leader who's really willing to go the whole way. A leader like Jesus Christ, who's willing to be crucified. Or a leader like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, despite a lifetime of Christian pacifism, decides that Hitler has to be killed and joins the plot to assassinate him. Unfortunately, they miss, and a few years later, Bonhoeffer is hung by the Gestapo. The sublime madness of those who are willing to sacrifice their personal lives and personal comfort out of loyalty to a cause. They're willing to go the distance. I'm thinking now of poor Julian Assange in prison in Britain, awaiting extradition to America, where they may well kill him, torture him, for being a journalist. And where are all of the other journalists? Are they talking about this? You rarely hear a word about the crucifixion of this courageous journalist. Edward Snowden is living in Russia. So these are exceptions. These are men and women who are able to muster the sublime madness of going the distance, delivering the coup de grace to the opponent so that one can actually take over. Sometimes those who identify with the overdog, it's as if they know something about this superego inhibition in their opponents. They know how to draw themselves up into the authoritarian parent image and to speak down to those who they regard as impertinent enough to challenge their God-given authority. They seem to assume that they have the right to rule, and that anyone who would challenge their rule is somehow not only wrong, but impertinent, and they know how to sternly look at their challengers and wag their fingers at them as if they were naughty children who should know better than to challenge the parental authority. And because we have an internalized superego, that behavior sometimes evokes it, and it's as if the challenger is suddenly haunted by an internal parental voice. And now the challenger feels like a naughty little boy. He loses his sense of himself as an adult. And sometimes he caves. The capacity of the overdogs to cloak themselves in righteous authority and to assume that anyone that would challenge their right to rule is somehow wrong or bad or delinquent, and they know it. Psychologically, that turns out to be a pretty effective tool in evoking the inhibition in the opposition.